testing. It's on. Okay. Hello, everyone. So nice to see you. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Peggy Van Scoyoc, and I am on the board of the Friends of the Page Walker History Center right here. I'm also Cary's oral historian, and as such, through Friends, we have gone out and interviewed more than 100 people to record and document their memories and their stories about what life has been like in Cary during their lifetimes. And we have collected the most incredible stories. So because of that, I transcribed them all. And then I took many of those interviews and I compiled them into 2 books. The first one came out in 2006. This is one called Just a Horse Stopping Place. And it is full of wonderful, rich stories about what life was like in Cary in a bygone time. This is really more cultural history material. But we're here tonight to talk about my second book, which came out in 2010, which is called Desegregating Cary. I call this more serious history. So, for in honor of Black History Month, we are going to be talking tonight about that history and how Cary, when it was very tiny, became a leader in desegregation for the state and even many places in the entire South. So we are going to start off talking about a little general history that really doesn't pertain specifically to Cary, but I just find this so fascinating. So I just want to read it to you. Okay, this is about Julius Rosenwald. He was a Jewish American who became part owner and president of Sears Roebuck and Company, and he met and befriended the African American educator Booker T. Washington, who founded Tuskegee University in Alabama. Washington implored wealthy philanthropists, including Andrew Carnegie, George Eastman, and Julius Rosenwald, to address the state of African American education in the U.S. In 1917, Rosenwald founded the Rosenwald Fund by contributing more than $4 million in 1917 as seed money to build primary grade schools across the South for Black students. Any community wanting a school was required to raise matching funds and contribute labor, both black and white, to increase their commitment to the projects. Also, white school boards had to agree to operate and maintain those schools. Many whites contributed funds, and the black communities alone raised more than $4.7 million to aid in construction, plus donated land and labor to provide a better education for their children. Between 1917 and 1948, when all the funds had been exhausted, 4,977 Rosenwald schools had been built in 11 states of the former Confederacy, as well as in Oklahoma, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. As a result of the collaboration between Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, approximately 1/3 of all the black children in those states were educated in these schools. 800 Rosenwald schools were built in North Carolina alone, the most of any other state. Many still exist today in various conditions. Isn't that unbelievable?
Yes.
I mean, when you look at this picture of the one with the children, that school is not in Cary, by the way. I'm not even sure where it was, but when you look at all those children standing in front of that school, and that was just one snapshot of time. And then you think about all the the children who went through that school over, from the time it was built until it closed. And then you multiply that by almost 5,000 schools. It's mind-boggling how many children benefited from that one generous land. Isn't that phenomenal? Yeah. Anyway, I just find that fascinating. So, anyway, so back to Cary. What was going on in Cary? Oh, that's what we're here for. In Cary, in 1877, the first black elementary school opened. That was only 12 years after the Civil War, and it operated for a number of years. And then, in 1895, what became known as the Cary Colored School opened. It was a 2-room wooden school. It stood behind the playground of Cary Elementary School at the head of Academy Street, to give you an idea where it was. That school was for grades 1 through 7. It was a 2-room school, and the principal and one of the teachers was a man named Dr. Reverend Meadows. He was one of the teachers, and also there was a second teacher. And he taught there, I think, until 1935 when he retired. The school stood until, and then once those children graduated from that school, then they were bused from Cary to the Barry O'Kelly High School, which was the black high school in Raleigh, in a section of Raleigh called Method, which is right across the street from the State Fairgrounds. So, the Cary Colored School stood at the end of Academy Street, basically back behind there, until 1936, when it was burned down. It was arson. So it burned down, and so the white school board said, well, you know, we're already busing all the black kids, the high school kids, to Method. And there's an elementary school there too, so let's just bus them all out there. And there was a small black school board in Cary, including members of the Evans family, a man named Bud Farrell, and various others. And they said, no. You're already busing all our high school students clear into Raleigh. We're not putting our babies on a bus. That is not happening. We need to rebuild our school. So they got together, and Sally Jones's mother and her uncle, Emily Jones and Golette Arrington, owned some land. That was the other excuse that the white board said, well, we don't have any land and we don't have any money. So Sally's mother and uncle had some land that they donated for that school. And then this little school board raised money to build that school. And then they managed to get the WPA, during the Depression, to fund building that school. And if you see on the second half of the article, it's underlined where it says Cary Colored School. It was one of the 8 schools that was funded through the WPA. This article was found by our wonderful researcher, Carla Michaels, who found a lot of these newspaper articles that we'll be seeing tonight. Thank you, Carla. So, anyway, that school was built, and yes, ma'am.
I'm looking at that. It's also listing Cary as C-A-R-E-Y High School. Was that in the same WPA project?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
That's when it could be spelled right at the time.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Because the WPA did rebuild Cary High School ahead of Academy Street.
Okay.
Probably about the same time. Okay, so the school got built. It was originally called East Cary Elementary School, and later on, it opened in 1937, and of course was a segregated elementary school. And eventually, the name was changed to Kingswood. That school still exists today, as many of you may know. It's a lot bigger now. It's been expanded a lot. But it started out as that replacement black elementary school for Cary on that same land that was donated by the black families. So, Okay, so from the time at the end of the Civil War until about the early 1960s, most black people and families in the South were tenant farmers. They were living on the farm, and they were farming and providing the labor for the white landowners. And so there were a whole lot of farms all over what is today's Cary, but most of them, or many of them, were on the west side of today's Cary. So how did those kids get educated? Well, on the west side of Cary, until 1942, those kids went to one of two schools. One was called Clark's, and the other was called Bell's School. And they were in, Bell's School was in Fearington. So those kids had to walk for miles to get to a pickup place where a bus would pick them up and take them the rest of the way to Fearington to go to school. And after the school day was over, they had to get on the bus and they were dropped off the same place and they had to walk home. So any weather, any time of the year. And that was true until 1942 when Apex opened their first colored elementary school. And then those kids got to go to Apex, which was a lot closer. So that was a real blessing for them.
Peggy, are you talking about Barrington, the one that's out there?
Way out there, with the belted cows.
Yeah.
Yeah, way out there. And then those kids, once they graduated from the elementary schools, they also were bused from, the western part of Cary into that method. I went to Mary O'Kelly High School as well. So, to recap a little bit of basic history, it was 1954 when the Supreme Court approved the measure. They decided, Brown versus the Board of Education, that to segregate public schools by race was unconstitutional. And when that came down, that meant that all the schools, the public schools in the country, had to desegregate. It didn't happen overnight after that ruling came down, but they had to start really planning to get this done. So 1 year later, in 1955, the North Carolina General Assembly voted that local school boards could develop their own plan for how they were going to go about desegregating their schools. They knew their people, they knew their culture, and so it was up to them to figure out how to do this for themselves. But the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare needed to approve any plan before it was put into place. So, that was going on in 1955, from 1955 on. So going back in time a little bit, there actually were two Green Hope high schools, white schools. The first one was in between Carpenter and Green Level, and so it was called Green Hope High School. And it opened in 1927 as, it was called a high school, but this is a white school for grades 1 through 12. And then in 1952, that school really didn't have enough high school age students to justify the cost of the teachers and what have you. So they converted that school to an elementary school, and then all the high school kids went to Apex High School. Of course, this is all on the west side of Cary. So the reason I'm telling you this at this point is because in August of 1963, when between the school years at night, that school was burned down. And it was arson. They never caught who did it. But it was widely suspected, I guess is the word, that the reason that that school was burned down because whoever did it did not want that school to be desegregated. Which means that in Cary's history, Cary was a very small place. They actually lost 2 schools to arson over time. due to race issues, which is very sad, especially considering how small Cary was at the time. So in 1960, by 1960, the white Cary High School at the head of Academy Street, the town was starting to grow. RTP was just opening that year. Families were coming in, being brought in by companies. The first company to get here for RTP was Strand, and all their employees came in from elsewhere. And so that high school the school was really starting to get crowded. So they decided they had to build a new white high school. So they went way out in the country to Walnut Street. And they built Cary High School, which is what it looks like today. There it is. Okay. And then the school at the head of Academy Street became Cary Elementary School for grades 1 through 8. And then the kids went to Walnut Street, all the way up to Walnut Street for high school. A few years later, when Cary had about 5,000 people population, a man named Henry Adams lived in Cary. He was a pharmacist. He had owned the drugstore that he later sold to Ralph Ashworth, which is now Ashworth Drugs. Henry was on 2 different school boards. He was on the Wake County School Board and also the smaller local Cary White School Board. At the time, there were 2 school boards in Wake County. So there was the Wake County School Board, that's what it was called, and it was for all the rural communities surrounding Raleigh, and then there was the Raleigh City School District as well. So there were 2 separate school districts. And Henry was on the Wake County one. And Henry could see that desegregation was coming, and he firmly believed in it. He thought it was absolutely the right thing to do. And so he made a declaration that if this was going to happen, and he was going to bring it about, he was going to do this in his own school. So he picked Cary High School on Walnut Street to be the first school in the Wake County School District to be desegregated. So Henry put together a team of people, and including the little local white Cary School Board, the little local black Cary School Board, the principals of both Cary High School and Barry O'Kelly High School, members of the NAACP, and they sat down and they hammered out a plan. This was absolutely not popular. People did not want this to happen. So Henry paid a huge price. He was getting death threats every night, middle of the night, horrible phone calls. His family was threatened. He lost a whole lot of his friends. They didn't speak to him for years, but he kept going. And so did everyone else who was in that committee trying to put this thing together. And once they had a plan, they sent it to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and they approved it. So I'm going to read to you what Henry's son had to say about his father and what he was doing. So this is Charlie Adams. My father was on the Board of Education on 2 levels. At the local level, he saw the black schools and the white schools, and he knew we had the haves and the have-nots. Then at the Wake County level, he saw that it was even worse than that, and all those things bothered him greatly. One of his goals was to do everything he could to start the integration process and get the black kids going to Cary. My dad told the principal, we can't integrate Wake County until somebody is willing to step forward and do it locally. As a member of the school board, if I'm going to integrate Wake County, I can't give it lip service and not do it in my own hometown. So he felt very strongly that Cary should be the first. Took a lot of courage. And he did it. So what did they do? Well, they, once they had their plan approved, then the principal of Barry O'Kelly and the NAACP chose 6 girls from Barry O'Kelly to come. This was all done voluntarily before legally they had to do this. That's the other very important thing here. They sent these 6 girls to come to all-white Cary High School in the fall of 1963. So, how did that go? Well, let me tell you 2 of their stories. So first of all, we're going to hear from Gwen Matthews, and this was her experience. As I prepared for my first day at a white high school, my father and I had a discussion about how to act and what to do, what not to do, how to respond, how not to respond, and certainly not to retaliate. The first week was extremely difficult. My cousin, Brenda, here are the 6 girls. So we're listening to Gwen Matthews now, and her cousin, who was Brenda, who's also up there, and I were on the same bus. When we got to Cary High and stepped off the bus, there was a crowd of people standing in front of the school blocking our way. They were all chanting, 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate. I don't think I've ever seen so many red, angry faces in my life. As we tried to enter the school, nobody ever touched us physically, but they blocked our entry. They tried to spit on us, but none of it hit us. And we were called lots of really ugly names. Because my parents and Brenda's parents were members of the NAACP, it was crucial for us to go all the way through and graduate from this white school. So we faced that crowd. Can you imagine that? I can't even imagine the terror and the courage that took. Okay, and then this is Lucille Evans. Okay, there was 1 freshman, 1 sophomore, 2 juniors, and 2 seniors. Gwen was a junior, and Lucille was a senior. So here is what Lucille had to say. The school bus stopped right up the street from my house, and I was always the first one on the bus, so I never had a problem with getting a seat. But the bus driver would always take off before I sat down to try to make me fall. So I started to sit on the front seat. That way, as soon as I got on the bus and he would take off, I would already be on my seat. At the elementary school, I had to change to another bus to go to the high school. It just so happened that my second bus that went right to the high school was from Morrisville, where another black girl lived. And that was Esther Mayo, she's talking about. So when I got on that bus, she was already there. I always had a seat because nobody would sit beside her. That worked out well. On my afternoon bus, if there were no seats except with me, instead of standing, the white students would never ask, may I sit here? They would just say, I want a seat, and sit down. So then when I started getting on the bus and there were no seats or somebody had their books on the seat, I didn't ask them if I could sit down. I would just say, I want a seat and sit down. Because that's what they did, I started doing the same thing, and it worked. But they were mean on the bus. They would throw spitballs at me. I had this little mean streak, and I'd say, I don't have any spitballs, but I've got some rocks back here. So if somebody throws some spitballs up here, I'm going to throw some rocks back there. And the spitballs stopped coming. Anyway, so it was tough. The year went well. It went very well. It was considered, smooth transition. No more schools were burned down, nobody died. We didn't have riots in the street. It was all going very well, according to the white people. Not so much for the black people. Anyway, so they survived that first year somehow. I can't even imagine. I mean, their daily experiences are also phenomenal stories in here. But they made it, and so then the next year more black kids were sent to Cary High School, and started to grow. So then in 2 years later, in September of 1965, Gwen's little sister, Deborah, was the first of 4 black students to desegregate Swift Creek Elementary School. Let me read to you what she had to say. So, oops. In 1965, as I entered the 5th grade, I was one of 4 black students to integrate Swift Creek Elementary School. My first experience with integration was at the age of 10. My first day was awful. It was absolutely, positively awful. Being one of 4 black students, we had to stand the entire way to school on the bus. We were never given an opportunity to sit down, even though there were plenty of 2-person seats on the bus. One white child would sit in an aisle side seat to keep us from sitting down, so we stood for the entire time from when we were picked up until we arrived at school. The bus driver did nothing because that was just the way it was. And of course, during the ride to school, we were teased and ridiculed the entire time. In school, it was the same scenario, being teased. The 4 of us were not in the same class. That was true of U6 as well. For the first 2 years, I was all alone as the only black child in my class, so it was a lonely situation. But 2 years afterward, there were 1 or 2 more people who began to befriend me. But for that first year was pretty traumatic. For those 1 or 2 children who did begin to talk or share or even just have a conversation with me, eventually they would begin to be teased for it, so they stopped. That first year, when she started telling me this story, she broke up years later. That first year, the teacher did not treat me too differently outwardly, but she did not do a whole lot to try and keep the other children from teasing me or to keep them from saying things to me, even when she heard them. The thing that I remember most about her was, this is where she got choked up, was her feeling toward my ability. I remember after the first reporting period, she sent a note home to my mother. The note basically told her to please talk to me because I was obviously copying from another child's paper. Her note strongly implied that I could not be performing or doing satisfactory work because I was black. She had never caught me cheating or copying from or even looking at anyone else's paper, but she sent the note home because it had to be happening. My mother was livid. There were a lot of things that were outside of her control, but this was an untruth because she knew our ability and she knew that I had not been cheating. She was very upset and she went to the school. I don't know whether she talked with the teacher by herself or with the principal too, but she did confront the situation. Afterward, we never received another note like that. I continued to excel and she gave me my grades. I think my mother wondered for a while whether or not she would be willing to be fair to me if she had this doubt or concern in her mind that I wasn't doing my work. But my teacher gave me the grades that I deserved. She wasn't necessarily unfriendly or even mean to me, but she didn't go out of her way to try to make my life any better for me either. So these kids, these are children that have been assigned this unbelievable, difficult task, and they got it done. I don't know how we did it. I really don't. So, as Henry's plan was tried, and it continued to succeed, word spread. And so other schools throughout First Wake County, and then, the Raleigh City schools, and then further and further out in North Carolina, heard about it. They started calling Henry and saying, look, you've got a plan that you've already tested, and it works. You're not having riots or whatever, but just share it with us. And it spread, and it spread, and it spread. And so pretty soon, little Cary became a model for desegregation throughout not only the state, but there were communities outside of North Carolina that heard and were calling up Henry and saying, could you share your plan with us too? Pretty impressive. I think that's something we all have to be extremely proud of. Okay, so in August of 1966, the HEW, who was overseeing desegregation, felt like it wasn't going fast enough in North Carolina, that we need to speed this up. So they set a quota that every white school had to now have between 100 and 300 black students in each white school. Well, that was a huge dilemma for Henry and his group because we didn't have that many black students. We just didn't have them. So they puzzled over what to do. And so he put his team back together again and they brainstormed. And they came up with this idea that had never been considered before, where they would create an all 9th grade, fully integrated school. So all the kids coming out of elementary school would go to this 9th grade school all together. They would get to know each other, they would get comfortable with each other, and then when they moved on to high school, a lot of those issues would have been broken down, and hopefully it would be a lot smoother. Well, when the white parents heard about this, they said, no, we hate this. We hate this whole idea. We don't want to integrate the schools, period, and we really hate this idea of this 9th grade school, and we're going to do everything we can to stop it. So they created a lawsuit to stop that school from being created. The school that Henry chose for this 9th grade was that, I missed one thing. So, I skipped over something. I don't get this. In 1965, as Deborah is going into Swift Creek Elementary School, and we've had 2 years of desegregation going on in Cary High School. Cary decided they needed another high school, but they wanted it segregated, black high school. So they built a black high school in Cary after desegregation was already a good 2 years into, the whole scheme. So that school was built and opened on Evans Road, and it was originally called West Cary High School, and it was a segregated high school for 2 years, from 1965 to 1967. So when Henry came up with the idea of a 9th grade only school, he chose that school to be the 9th grade middle school. And today it is West Cary Middle School on Evans Road. Anyway, so this lawsuit was going through the courts, and that took a while. But they went ahead with the school anyway, they opened it, and it worked. It worked really well. But eventually that lawsuit was making its way through the courts. And so I want to read to you how that went. Okay, this is Carl Mills, who was the principal of White Cary Elementary School at the time, and here's what he had to say. When the advisory council recommended to the Board of Education to integrate, it made sense to put all the 9th graders into one school at West Cary. Out of 300 and some 9th graders, 30 were black students, which was somewhat of a token situation. There was a certain element of people in the area who were opposed to setting up that school. They took the case to the North Carolina Supreme Court and protested integration. Just as soon as the case was presented to the judge, he immediately called a timeout to confer with the 2 attorneys, and as soon as they returned to their seats, he said, "Case dismissed." He threw it out. So they had nowhere to stand, and here's the newspaper articles about how that went through the court system. So, anyway, this worked so well, in fact, that in 1969 they decided to do it again and create a 6th grade only school. And so they designated Kingswood as this fully integrated 6th grade school. And it also worked very well. And that school was a 6th grade only school until the early 1980s. It worked out well. So, and these two plans also spread across the state, across the South. Other school systems were starting to adopt this too, because again, it was tried, it worked, you know, it was a good thing. So Henry did it again, which was great. Anyway,
Peggy, I just want to mention I taught at that school.
you taught at that school?
Kingswood, sixth grade.
Did
Yes.
you really?
Yes, it was a great school.
When it was a 6th grade school?
When it was a 6th grade center to make.
Really?
Grade, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was great, it was a great
So you could give us
experience.
some real insight right now that way.
Another interview.
Interesting. Okay, so we've heard about how this was going for the black kids, going into these white schools for the first time. But what was it like for a black teacher to go into a white school and teach mostly white kids? Well, let me tell you. So this is a lady named Carolyn Rogers, and here's one of her unbelievable many stories about being there she is, being a teacher in a white school. After graduating from Barry O'Kelly High School, I went to Barber Scotia College in Concord. I majored in English and minored in French. I was sent to Cary Elementary School for an interview after that. Until then, I had lived in an all-black neighborhood. I went to college at an all-black school. I went to an all-black high school and an all-black elementary school, so I had been in this all-black environment, insulated from the outside world, except for when I was living on the farm as a child. She was a tenant farm child, and she worked the fields when she was a child. When we lived on the farm, we lived in a house on the owner's land because we were tenant farmers. We established a relationship with them that was a cordial relationship, so I had been insulated from all derogatory remarks. I was hired for a teaching position, and I started at Cary Elementary in the fall of 1969. I was one of 3 black teachers on staff, with a PE teacher and a shop teacher. Then they hired me, another black lady, to teach English. There was one teacher across the hall from me, an older farm lady who taught English too. One day she came across the hall to my classroom and she said, "I want to ask you a question. I want to know why you want to be in my school." I said, "Your school?" "Yes, why do you want to be in my school? We don't want you here, you know that." I said, "Well, I was hired to do a job, and I'm going to do that job to the best that I know how." As the year progressed, she and I actually became the best of friends. She even invited me to her home, and sometimes we would go back to that conversation when she asked me why I was in her school. And she said, "That was just my ignorance showing, but you taught me differently." She was able to talk with me about that day. Being an older person, she was brought up in that world where the black stayed in their place and the white stayed in their place, and never the twain shall meet. For her to be able to see that this is not the way it should be was a milestone. When she realized that we should all be together and that she was able to actually sit down and talk about it, made a big difference in her life and in mine. She was a very talented teacher, and we learned a lot from each other. Yeah. So, anyway, so I think it was 1970 or 1971 when busing started, and that's a whole other conversation. So I think we'll leave off education at the moment. and right there. But just a few more details about civil rights in general. So about 1960, then, all those tenant farm families that were working on the farms began to find ways to get off the farms and find other ways to support themselves. And it was a tough struggle. But one of the ways that many families did that, they were lucky to meet members of the Evans family. Clyde Evans Sr. had a lot of land along what is now Evans Road. And Clyde had a dream. His dream was to create a black community along his road on his land that would have nice houses, that would have a school and a church, and that his road would be paved. And he lived long enough to see it and bring it to fruition. So what he did was he started selling housing lots to black families at what he called sacrifice prices so that they could build their homes in his new community that he wanted to build. And then he either, I think he donated all the land for the Cary First Christian Church, which is on Evans Road. And then he either donated or he sold at sacrifice prices the land for West Cary had been segregated high school, then became the West Cary Middle School on Evans Road as well. And then he even managed to talk the town into taking over his road and paving it. So he got his entire wish, and he created his own little community there. And that helped a lot of families get off the farm, you know, and move forward, which was a big plus for them. A little more history, just to refresh. So on February 1st, 1960, that was the date that the students from the A&T University in Greensboro had the first lunch counter sit-in. 10 days later, on February 10th, all the lunch counters at Fayetteville Street Mall in Raleigh had sit-ins from black students from all of the black colleges in and around Raleigh. And the response to that was that they were all closed for public safety. Isn't that awful? Well, it didn't last long, because there were so many protests and so much was going on that they realized that this wasn't a good idea. And so, I think it was only 10 days or 2 weeks later, those lunch counters were all reopened, desegregated. So it worked. In 1960 again, 1960 was a big year, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, formed in Raleigh at Shaw University, which, by the way, is a historically black college or university that opened its doors in 1865, the year the Civil War ended, right here in Raleigh, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. SNCC was formed by those students basically for two reasons: for voters' rights and to continue desegregating the schools and the community as well. So that was happening right here in Raleigh at the time. And then throughout the 60s and beyond, more and more things began to be desegregated. Theaters, grocery stores, we had a lot of grocery stores in Cary. They haven't been desegregated, but they started to be desegregated. Restaurants, other stores, even public pools finally began to be desegregated over time. So what happened to those women that I've been reading to you about? Well, let me tell you. So first of all, this book came out in February of 2010, and in October of that year, we had a panel discussion here, and we invited a lot of the people who were in the book, who we had interviewed that were in the book, to come and speak to us, completely unscripted. It was unbelievable. So they came in and they all stood up and they spoke, and it was just a phenomenal night. Anyway, we took pictures of them. So this picture of Carolyn was taken that night. This is in 2010. So Carolyn, who's the teacher, what did she do? She used her she had a master's degree as well, and she used her master's degree. She continued to teach in desegregated schools throughout her teaching career. Her last position, she was assistant principal at Davis Middle School before she retired. Gwen, also from 2010, Gwen didn't just desegregate one school, Gwen desegregated two. So she was one of the ones who walked off that bus in 1963 and was spat at. She made it through her junior and senior year at Cary Elementary School, Cary High School, and graduated from there. She eventually went on to desegregate Meredith College. She was the first black student at Meredith College. And she got a master's degree from Meredith in English. And I think it was in 2007, I just love this, Meredith set up a Gwen Matthews scholarship fund to honor her for her contribution to their school. I think that's fabulous. Anyway, Gwen became an English teacher and a counselor, and her entire career she spent teaching and counseling at Lake Tech until she retired. And then her little sister Deborah followed her big sister's footsteps. So she survived Swift Creek Elementary School. She ended up at Cary High School. She was 8 years younger than Gwen, so there were 8 years of desegregation going on between them. So she said that she had a much easier time. Still wasn't perfect, but it was a lot easier for her. She graduated from Cary High School, and she ended up at Meredith as well, following in Gwen's footsteps again. Deborah also got a master's from Meredith in counseling, and the last time I talked to her, which was probably that night, she was the director of human resources at North Carolina State University. She's also an ordained minister. Pretty incredible what these people did. So I think we will end there, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. Anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I've read in various places that the segregated black schools had inferior materials and old textbooks and not very high standards. So I'm wondering, after the schools were integrated, how did they keep up with white students that had better preparation in prior years? Do we know anything?
It was tough.
Yeah.
And that's true. I mean, I heard stories about kids that were going to these black schools and their books, were missing half the pages and were falling apart. Their school bus was falling apart and it was a reject from the white school. All of that. They had, and how the teachers taught with virtually no materials is kind of mind-boggling too. Anyway, and then they get to these white schools and the teachers were ignoring them, they weren't answering their questions, they were on their own, and the other students wouldn't help them. So they just had to muddle through as best they could. And so these girls did somehow.
Did they all graduate? The six?
Yes, they all did. They all made it. They all made it through, and they all did a lot with their lives, which is pretty incredible. So yeah, it was tough. So
Why are all these schools desegregated by girls?
that's a really good question.
Because they did it in the elementary grades and in other areas.
Deborah, she was one of 4 black students, but I think there was one boy at Swift Creek Elementary with her. But the high school level, I've never had anyone tell me this, but my guess is that they didn't want to bring boys in at first because, first of all, they might be more aggressive, and secondly, they didn't want their white girls. They didn't want black boys to pay attention to white girls. And that was a real issue at the Little Rock, 9. There were several boys in there that were accused of paying attention to black girls, and they were almost lynched. And it was just horrible what happened then. So they learned, they learned from that. And so that's my guess. That they
They
started.
realize how nasty girls can be to each other?
Well, the girls were counseled, don't retaliate, don't respond, you can't do that, so.
Threatening to throw rocks is retaliating.
Right. Anyway, yes.
Peggy, so we've talked about schools and obviously people living as tenement farmers working their way up. And we know in the history of Cary that we had a segregated movie theater and we had a segregated doctor's office and the things we've heard stories about. Were there any black businessmen who ever gained notoriety in this town in those days, or anybody that stands out to you? I mean, besides just what goes on in the schools, what's going on in the community? We've got separate churches, but...
That's a really good question. There were a few white people who would let black people come in the back door to buy groceries, that kind of thing. They could come into a restaurant and buy food, but they couldn't sit down to eat it in any of the restaurants. But
Can't think of any black-owned
not
businesses.
in Cary. There was a store in Apex that sold farm supplies. And they would even run credit for the black farmers. And so, so they were, I think he was a white owner though, but he was very, open to helping black farmers as well. And so he did a lot for that community until, they were discouraged from doing any of that kind of thing, which is sad.
Good question. You've been reading all from the black community. Did you interview anybody from the white community to get their reaction of why they did what they did, everything like that? Is that part of
Yeah, I
it?
did, and I interviewed quite a few, and they basically said it was our ignorance, it was the way it was how we were raised. We never questioned and we never thought about it. We just didn't think about it. It's just the way society was. And now they look back on it with horror at themselves, and what was going on. But at the time, they didn't question it, which, looking back, it's hard for us to understand, but.
From a northerner's perspective, that's a really good question, because the way we saw it, I had high school kids in '66 that were black, we never thought anything of it. It was what it was. And we would look at the South and think, oh my God, why are they doing that? It was very hard to comprehend unless you had grown up in that culture.
You weren't in Boston then.
Yeah.
Or in New York City.
Or New York City, right, because you didn't question it either, right? It's just what it was.
We had one black girl in my class.
Okay.
And that was because it was a special program, and she was bussed in.
There you go.
She wasn't a neighborhood kid.
It didn't go so smoothly in Boston.
I lived in New Jersey growing up in the 50s and 60s, and I went to Catholic school, which we only had one of in town, no black students. But I lived a block from a public school, but that was an all-black school, and my street was gerrymandered that I would have had to walk over a mile to get to a different school. We only had 2 places in town where black families lived. So we were segregated. I mean, we didn't have separate water fountains or anything, but the same feeling was there.
Yeah,
And-
redlining though.
Yes, yes, and Boston was so violent when they were forced to integrate in the 70s. And when I moved there, I was very surprised that they asked me about my ethnic background, because they had these conclaves, they had the Italian North End, they had the Irish Dorchester, and they had Roxbury, which was where the blacks lived, and they kept to themselves. And where I grew up, it was calmer, but we still had the segregation, you know, areas that, you know, they lived there and they lived in one other place on the south side of town, and that was it.
Right, so it's where they were allowed to, you know, this is your section, this is your
Right.
section, but once desegregation started to happen, people segregated themselves. You know, and hung with themselves
Yes.
and whatever, and that's true of churches, still today. That's still true of neighborhoods often. And so neighborhood schools can be fairly, you know,
Right.
fairly segregated just because that's the neighborhood.
Well, up north it was de facto segregation, and that was okay, because it wasn't legal segregation.
Right, yeah, it was,
It just happened that way,
right.
happened for
People
reasons.
chose to live together.
Right.
Actually, it wasn't just
And to
happening.
redline.
Yeah, your realtors and things, and,
Right.
you know, people just weren't permitted to buy into neighborhoods, so that
The
the
banks.
compartmentalization of people was created through laws and practices, so it wasn't just happenstance.
Right.
One of the interesting things down here, I did my student teaching at West Cary Junior High School, and after school, kids would come in to play basketball in the gym, and some of the kids were lived in the neighborhood there. They were black kids, and they had gone to the high school, and several of them talked about how hard it was to lose their school. In other words, it became integrated because it was their school. I forget what their, you know, they had whatever their mascot was and all this kind of stuff. And I think, you know, that's another aspect of this that is hard to understand sometimes, how much a school is more than just, you know, we had crappy books and all this kind of stuff, but we had teachers that were interested in us.
Right.
And so how those things, you know, sort of balanced or played out makes this whole attempt to integrate, you know, very complex and very difficult.
Right, it wasn't by accident that the black schools were integrated.
Yeah. Well, usually that meant that the black principal lost his job and he became the assistant principal or disciplinarian.
But the white people didn't have to give up their schools.
Yeah.
Right, no, it was almost always black students coming into white schools. There was one school in Raleigh that was black and they brought white kids into it, I forget which one that was. Anyway, but that was rare. That was rare. In fact, there were two school districts. There was the Raleigh City School District and there was the rural Wake County School District. They merged in 1976 because of white flight going on in Raleigh. And they put it to a popular vote to whether to do that or not. And the population said, no, we don't want it. We did it anyway. It wasn't very popular, but it happened anyway, and for good or ill. And so the combined districts are now, of course, called Wake County School District. It's very large. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
I read your book, and there were some schools that were going to be named after prominent black people like Bun Farrell and Clyde Evans. But Wake County decided to last minute change the policy to not allow those schools to be named after those people. Why do you think that Wake County decided to make that decision?
I don't know. That's a good question, but they did. I think to be fair, they applied that as well to, white people.
I don't think they ever named school, their practice has not been to name schools here after people.
Right.
Yeah, that was changed.
It's elementary school. Yeah.
That was
talk
changed
about
last minute.
the school that's opening with the Y over in Southeast Raleigh. They talked about naming that after a person.
Wow.
And they also talked about naming it South. I don't know what it ended up being, but
Sorry?
My grandfather went to a school in Raleigh that was named after someone.
Yeah, Broughton.
No,
Yeah,
it was
there
Mary
was-
something.
It was when the two districts were separated. Raleigh City Schools did name a lot of schools after black people, but Wake County decided to refrain from doing that. like very last minute, they were gonna name West Cary Middle School or high school at the time, Clyde Evans Senior High School, but they decided not to, very last minute, and changed the policy to where only people who serve in Wake County Public Schools, and they were only able to name high school or schools after them. So that's how they still got away with naming Adams Elementary. Adams Elementary. So.
When they were building what became Kingswood, Bun Farrell was so instrumental in making that school happen. He was on that little black school board. And they were going to name it Farrell Elementary School, and at that exact same time, they said, well, we've changed our mind, you can't do that. So they named the street after him, and it is called Bun Farrell Street, which is right, so they kind of got around it a little bit, so at least his name's out there,
Well, but the interesting thing about naming schools, when I was in school in New York City, the elementary schools was Public School 208, Public School 184, they were all numbered.
Yeah.
They started changing that so that the school I had gone to, they changed the name to Elsa Evelyn Elementary School. Well, she was the principal when I was going to school there. By the time they named it that, the neighborhood was Haitian. So then they wanted, people in the neighborhood wanted them to change it to something else. I don't know what they wound up doing, but that was bizarre.
It waited too long.
Yeah.
I think given what we've seen at UNC, it's probably better that we don't use names, because the name can become controversial later on.
Like Carrboro?
But then there's also the thing where the school or the buildings that were named after people, those buildings at UNC that were like named after people, they were famously Confederate leaders. But then there's also the question on why they couldn't name schools or buildings after people who were for desegregation and for the equality of black people.
Because they didn't give money.
Yeah, usually buildings and campuses are after donors.
I want to know what's going to happen to Lee Highway.
Peggy, I'll help you end here with one quick thing. While I was sitting here, I was also looking at something on U.S. News and World Report's demographics of Cary High School today. And I thought it was interesting, because I wasn't aware of this. My kids went to Cary High School, and we still go by there and participate in some things. Cary High School is now a majority-minority school, 51% non-white.
Really?
And the reason for that, according to the statistics they had, was it's 19% black and 21% Hispanic, and then there's a certain amount of Asian and Native American in the mix as well. I thought that's interesting. Who could imagine what the people in 1950 would have thought to what we are today? And the school is doing just fine. But it's just interesting that times change.
Yeah, the diversity is really changed a lot.
We have charter schools now that are drawing some off, and private schools.
Good job, Peggy.
Yes.